On the morning of All Saints, in the year 1755, all hell broke loose in the bustling city of Lisbon, Portugal. At the time, Lisbon was one of Europe's most religious cities. And so most of the city's residents were in church to celebrate this high holy day. But at around 9:30 in the morning, a massive earthquake struck the ocean floor in the North Atlantic, and the tremors barreled towards the city. The Basilica of St. Vincent, the patron saint of the city, was packed that morning. It was standing room only as the crowd eagerly gathered together for prayer and celebration. And just as the priest of the basilica intoned, "Let us all rejoice in the Lord," the very walls of St. Vincent's began to shake violently. The church bells clanged as the church tower shuddered under the seismic waves, throwing it off of its very foundation. Candlesticks fell to the floor as the stained glass exploded into shards all around them. As their world turned into chaos, the congregants split up into two groups: those who stayed in the church to pray for deliverance from these cosmic forces of chaos, and those who fled in terror out into the street. And that's when the second and stronger shockwave hit, a 7.0 on the Richter scale. That's a strong enough wave to damage even modern buildings engineered specifically to resist earthquakes. Lisbon's medieval architecture stood absolutely no chance. Churches, homes, and government buildings all collapsed, burying both those seeking shelter in the buildings and falling on the crowds that had fled into the streets. And if that wasn't enough, then the fires started. The flames from all of those knocked over candles were fanned by the strange howling winds now whipping through the city, creating a raging inferno among all of the wooden debris scattered across the destroyed city. And then a third shockwave hits the city, although frankly, at this point, there's not much left standing. No one knows for sure how many died from this catastrophe in Lisbon. Some say as few as 15,000, while others estimate more in the range of 50,000. But however many it was, the Lisbon All Saints' Day earthquake came to be a mark not just of a deadly natural disaster, but the very death of an entire worldview. Of a worldview common in the medieval world, in which disasters like earthquakes and storms and famine and pestilence were all understood to be brought onto people by God primarily as a punishment for sin. Too much evil and be smote. But not only did this particular disaster befall a pious people on a particularly holy day, but it happened in a very particular place and period in which new scientific discoveries in fields like physics in meteorology could offer up new mechanistic and natural explanations for things like earthquakes and floods. And so people began to ask what is essentially a new question. A question that continues to weigh on us in the modern world. We ask, why? Why did God create a world with things like devastating earthquakes and terminal illnesses seemingly baked in? We ask, if God has absolute power over this creation, then why doesn't God swoop in already and put an end to these great acts of evil that we are all confronted with anytime we turn on the news? Saying these disasters are a righteous punishment just doesn't cut it anymore. There's simply too much innocent suffering seemingly built into our existence for that explanation to ever put us at ease again. Now, don't get me wrong, there were prototypes of this question before our modern world. Job calls God to task about it in one way. The teacher in Ecclesiastes also meditates on similar questions. And it turns out, embedded in this morning's parable from Jesus about wheat and weeds, we can discern at least a partial answer to our question. So let's look closely at what happens in this story. A landowner, we are told, provides good seeds to be sown in his wheat field. But then an enemy comes in the night and sows weeds or tares among all of the wheat. When the two kinds of seed sprout, we see both wheat and weeds all mixed together in the field. The farm's laborers are puzzled by this development. And they go to the landowner and they ask, "We thought you sowed good seed in this field. So where did all these weeds come from?" And in response to this question, the owner explains that an enemy has done this. That the reason there are weeds in the field is not because the landowner gave out bad seed, but because of the work of this enemy. The laborers then are eager to set things right. And they ask the owner if they should go out and pluck up all the weeds that have sprouted. But the owner tells them no. That in their attempts to pull up the weeds, they will inadvertently uproot the wheat with it. Now, the weeds here, or tares in older translations, are in the original writing referred to by an old Sumerian word, zizania, which refers to a plant that we now call darnel. And darnel, if you look at it, actually looks a whole lot like wheat. They grow up together looking very similar. But where wheat is nourishing for us, darnel is actually poisonous. So rather than have the workers try to separate out this good wheat from the poisonous weeds, the landowner tells them they must wait until the harvest time. Once the wheat is ready to be harvested, then the reapers will come. and they will discern the good from the poisonous, and collect the wheat into the barn, and toss all of that poisonous darnel into the fire. This, Jesus tells us, is what the kingdom of heaven is like. So stepping back now, in this story, we see these urgent questions being addressed. Questions about the reality of suffering that we all face in this world created by God. Our first question comes from the laborers themselves after they have noticed the darnel growing in their field. They go to the landowner, the one who provided the seed, and they say, "We thought that you sowed good seed in this field. Where did all these weeds come from?" The presence of the weeds is a problem. And it's not just an agricultural problem. Underneath the question about the nature of the seeds is a question about the landowner, about the integrity, the character of the landowner himself. What they are asking is that we thought that you had intended the good for us. So where did all these poisonous weeds come from then? This is the same impulse we have now in the face of evil. The faithful turn to God and ask, often in bewilderment, even rage, "Why, God? Why did you let this happen? We thought that you sowed good seed, and yet what do we find but weeds growing up in the midst of the wheat?" This is where we begin to address the problem of suffering. It begins with the laborers questioning the landowner. And for some, that kind of questioning makes them uncomfortable. After all, who are we fallible mortals to question the moral integrity of God Almighty? But the insight that Jesus provides us in this parable is that this questioning of God in the face of suffering is not a faithless question, but is in fact a faithful response to the evil and suffering we face in this world. Think about it. If you didn't believe God existed at all, or if you believe that God existed but was an absentee landlord, leaving us to our own devices, or even if you thought that God was a cruel tyrant, this line of questioning probably would never even occur to you. Why wouldn't there be poisonous weeds? Who are you going to complain to? It's only with the expectation, the belief that God is good, that God intends the good, that this questioning of God arises. And so the laborers ask with faith, "Where did these weeds come from? We thought you sowed good seed, but here we see weeds." And the landowner responds to them directly and tells them an enemy has done this. A simple statement from the landowner. But the implications here are complex. But what Jesus is saying is that God is not the source of evil. Now that might seem like an obvious answer. But think about it. Sometimes to comfort ourselves, we come up with reasons why God might have brought this suffering on us or others. We see within the gospel accounts themselves this idea going around that suffering is a punishment of sin. Even in our own day, who hasn't heard someone say, God will never give you more than you can handle? Or maybe you've been told, oh, it's all part of God's plan. That's another popular one. But in Jesus' parable here, the answer is no. God did not mix in poison with the good wheat. An enemy has done this. The suffering of this world, the evil we encounter, it is from an enemy of God. Here's the first bit of the good news, the gospel, in relation to our questioning of God. God, did you plant these evil weeds among us? No, God answers. 1,000 times no. God does not bring this evil upon us. God does not plant poisonous darnel in the fields of our lives because he is angry with us or because he wants to give us moral choices. No, it is an enemy who has done this. How did the enemy manage to do this? Where does this enemy come from? Our parable doesn't say, and our human minds struggle to comprehend. We get hints of an answer in descriptions of primordial chaos and creatures like the serpent in the garden choosing to align themselves with that chaos. And there's plenty to meditate on in biblical stories about cosmic rebellions and a creation that groans in labor pains as it waits for redemption. But all of that takes us well beyond the scope of this parable. Jesus' point, speaking in the midst of a people who are already in the field, looking at wheat and darnel growing up together, is that the evil that they find there is not God's will. It is an intruder into God's good creation. And humans have become entangled and complicit in it. And now we find ourselves in the middle of it, confronted by it daily. And it's hard for us to discern the difference. The darnel looks an awful lot like wheat to our eyes. And so we are called on to tend to the field here and now, with its wheat and its weeds, acting righteously as best as we can, but ever recalling that in this world, a church of only the pure and the perfect is nothing but pure fantasy. It isn't up to us to gather those weeds and throw them out. We are, after all, incapable of making an accurate judgment. Of, as last week's parable put it, knowing the true state of the soil that the seeds have been scattered in. Instead, we are called on to wait and watch and work. As next week's parables put it, we spread the kingdom not with a machete, cutting down all that we dislike, but like mustard seeds, taking over a garden, like yeast infiltrating and transforming the dough, knowing that what God started was good, and that in the end, God will set it all right.